How's everybody doing today? Dr. Jerry Duggar with the Simple 7 Lifestyle Podcast. Glad you're with us today. We've got a special treat. I'm super stoked, super excited to have on one of my mentors and one of my teachers, Mr. Brendan Vermiere. And we're going to be talking about some really cool stuff related to brain and mental health. That's really his forte. And so I think this discussion is going to be very enlightening. I'm certainly looking forward to it. If you're listening to this while you're driving down the road, you might want to come back and listen to this when you have a pad of paper and a pencil in front of you, because I'm anticipating some really cool bombs of information from my friend here. So welcome, Brendan. Tell us just a little bit about yourself and where you hail from, and we'll get rolling.
Yeah, thanks, man. No, Jerry, seriously, it's a privilege. I have a lot of respect for you and your knowledge, and it's really a great privilege and honor to have the opportunity to collaborate with you, learn with you, and your fellow peers in the FMHP group. So I think we will have a pretty cool, enlightening, maybe, kind of neural busting conversation. And I mean, I feel like my inspiration is already on high just looking at your awesome background there with the painting. So it'll be fun. But yeah, I mean, we connected through the FMHP program, which is my
tell everybody real quick. I'm sure we'll get into that, but spell that out real quick, because it's amazing stuff.
Might as well. The Functional Mental Health Practitioner Certificate Program, a little bit of a mouthful, but that FMHP designation that you're in class 1, and I'm just enormously grateful for class 1 because you guys are helping me bring it to the world, and we're already seeing a lot of traction and growth with it. The whole project is turning out like so much bigger than I could have ever anticipated, but it's a privilege, right? Because it really was one of those things. I've been an educator for other, institutes and certification programs. I've been through countless, certificate programs myself. And over the course of time, organically, and, I'm sure we'll get into some of my background and story and whatever, but it just got to this point that, I mean, I had done enough research myself, had enough professional experience, created enough of my own content that it was just like, we just need a new designation. We need a new curriculum. We need a new breed of mental metabolic health practitioner, because even within the functional medicine space and holistic health space, which is, a very eclectic kind of melting pot of different modalities and professional credentials, MDs, DCs, NDs, RDs, PTs, and everything in between. But we needed a standardization. So I'm just kind of doing my part as one dude with my community and my tribe to just try to create this new breed of practitioner that can help the masses with getting to those root causes of their mental and metabolic health struggles. So yeah, it's a privilege.
One of the most fascinating things about being in this space of functional medicine is just the diversity of practitioners. I mean, I remember my very first functional medicine conference I went to. I'm a chiropractor. I'm sitting next to an acupuncturist and a psychologist and a MD and just it didn't matter what letters were behind your name. It was not so much where you came from. It was this idea of kind of coming together and thinking about problems from a different framework. Mm-hmm. And it's so refreshing. I just love it. You've got so many cool people, and even inside of your program, just such diverse backgrounds of people coming in, that they always bring new things and new ideas and ways to approach things. So I applaud you for having the clarity of vision to kind of dive in and say, hey, we can improve this. We can improve this landscape, and you're just going after it. So it's super impressive. Now you've got an interesting kind of road yourself. Let's dive in a little bit to your story. I know you could tell the nitty gritty details, but let's hit the major parts, because you've had an interesting journey into this space.
Yeah, no, I think that was really well said with the melting pot. And it's kind of cool, right? Because with, we talk about the microbiome all the time, kind of one of the big focal points of our methodology at FMHP. And one of the few things that's well established in the literature about the microbiome is well, we know that diversity of microorganisms in your microbiota equals better health. That's one of the very few definitive things that has come out of, who knows how much money has gone into microbiome research. And that's kind of the one of the very few things that we have pretty well established is diversity of that ecosystem equals better health. And so to me, that's what gets me excited about functional medicine as an industry, is the diversity is what gives us our healing potential, and potential kind of being the key word. And so obviously, I think the more that we can work together to, build this out, whether it's FMHP or just the greater industry at large, like we have a pretty cool opportunity. And, I appreciate your commending me on kind of that clarity of vision, because it wasn't always clear. There was times in my life it was extremely dark and murky, and I didn't know where I was going or what I was trying to do. So like, you've heard my long, painful version of, what was
a very cool story, even all the details.
I'm glad you think so. It gets weirder and weirder to even like try to tell it, because my perspective of my own past changes. It evolves, and my neuroplasticity is constantly changing. So my belief systems of my own experience change. But kind of the cliff notes, it's, I'm good at running through the cliff notes of like, well, it was 17, I was first put on a psychiatric drug, and I was just doing a physical for high school sports for wrestling season coming up, winter, and I mentioned to my doctor of like, oh, winter makes me kind of sad and depressed and whatever. So, without a referral to a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, no blood work, no objective testing of any kind, just, oh, well, let's put you on some Zoloft to help with that sort of seasonal affective sort of thing that you're depicting there. So that's 17, and I'm just going through high school and trying to find my way in life. After high school, my at the time life aspiration was to be a Navy SEAL, which it had previously been a UFC fighter, because I grew up doing martial arts and loved combat sports and MMA. Somehow Navy SEAL seemed like more practical, which I don't know that it is, but it made sense.
They're both insane to me.
Yeah, I think I had like that little kind of tough guy complex, for a little bit in high school, and just try and find my way. It was one of those like, my heart was in the right place, but not my head sort of thing. But either way, so I actually joined the Navy after high school. I as soon as I turned 18, my parents were not thrilled about it, but I went off and signed a 6-year Navy SEAL contract, and, worked super hard for that goal. While I was in boot camp, they found I had an injury, an inguinal hernia. It was my second one. They deemed that it was pre-existing. And if it's a pre-existing injury, well, it's not the government or taxpayers' responsibility to pay for your pre-existing injury, right? Because some people join the military for, benefits, which is not what I was doing. So then I had my Navy SEAL aspiration kind of torn out of my hands, and that sucked. And there's a lot of nuance to that story and what I went through with that was awful. But just for the sake of kind of covering like a decade in a short, synopsis, it's like I get home, I start getting more depressed, because that was my sense of purpose. And I always make a strong point of that. That sense of purpose is essential for mental health. Right. Meanwhile, I'm struggling as sort of a high functioning, depressed young man. So it was when I was like 21, I was back in front of the same doctor reporting similar, depression. The Zoloft, by the way, which is what I was put on when I was 17, did not work for me at all. I didn't respond well to it. Obviously, now we have this stern black box warning of, well, sexual dysfunction, increased suicidal ideation, and, whatever. Right. So this time it was like, which is how the conventional psychiatric system is, of like, well, let's just try a different,
try the next one.
Try a different drug. So the SSRI didn't work. Let's put you on Wellbutrin, which is a dopamine drug. All right. That one helped a little bit, stabilized me a little bit. And then because of, kind of the repetitive history, this time I got referred to a clinical psychiatry clinic, underwent the formal process, which is all subjective, by the way. Like, sit in this, phosphorescent lit room, click on the keyboard when this thing pops up on the screen, answer subjective questionnaire. So then I get formally diagnosed as ADHD, major depressive disorder, whatever. And I probably fit on multiple spectrums with all that. But I was going through a really hard time in life. I was in the early stage of entering what was as cliche as it now is with sensationalism on Instagram. But I was in a very like codependent, narcissist, empath, toxic relationship. And I admit it. And I take ownership. Yeah, I paid in full, right? So I paid in full for that experience. And I almost died because I overdosed on the Wellbutrin, spent, 5 nights in the ICU, another 3, 4 nights in a psychiatric ward. So I know firsthand experience, and this is kind of the ultimate punchline, is like I experienced firsthand what the conventional approach to psychiatry and suicide attempts is. I had my stomach pumped. I got locked up in the psychiatric ward. I even like, what are my medical rights? Like, can I refuse treatment? And it's like, well, yes, but because you would be deemed a threat to yourself, then you're going to get sent to an asylum against your will. So it's like, okay, so what kind of medical right is that then?
Yeah, not very good options there on the table
yeah,
for you.
not really, right? So kind of went along with it. So, and that was just the beginning. I wish that was my rock bottom. I wish like being hospitalized was my rock bottom, but it wasn't. Like life got harder, through that relationship. And that's actually what got me into functional medicine. Was my, at the time, fiance got really, really sick. Nobody could figure out what was wrong with her. And at the time, I was a very scientifically minded, very physiologically educated fitness nutrition professional. And since none of the medical professionals, physical therapists, chiropractor, naturopath, medical doctor, nobody could figure out anything that was helpful with her. And she had all these, complex chronic illness clusters of symptoms.
Right. Tough stuff to figure out sometimes.
Very hard, right? So I mean, I just took it upon myself because I loved her, I cared about her. So I went down all the rabbit holes, and it was literally trying to save her that steered me into functional medicine. I didn't save her. She ended up taking her own life in 2020, but I did manage to save myself, and ultimately worked through a lot of my own traumas and issues and whatever. So it's like somewhere along the line, I learned enough, I experienced enough that then I was kind of qualified to then be able to pass along what I had learned. And I did that through other businesses and institutes and whatever. And I loved educating so much and the research. So it was this very organic evolution that took me from scrub that's at the gym when I was 17 to now, having this, kind of little conglomerate thing that I do. Crazy journey though. And trying to tell this story and help people understand it's insane.
Well, I mean, I think in order to really recognize that we need a new model, you really kind of have to experience the dysfunction of the current system. And anybody who's kind of been a patient or been, in that model realizes that we just don't have a complete picture. It's like the people at the table, so to speak, are usually a general practitioner, family doctor, maybe a therapist, and usually that's it. So just like you experienced, hey, I think I'm a little depressed, or your friend tells you, "God, you kind of, are you depressed?" Pretty soon you're like, "I guess I'm depressed," and the doctor says, "Here, start taking these medications," with no real clear idea of how to understand what's really going on. And mental health professionals, counselors, therapists, certainly are excellent at kind of finding the childhood traumas and the dysfunctional thinking patterns and what have you. But if they don't understand what's happening actually in the physical brain itself, they miss half of the equation, or more than half of the equation. So maybe that's an interesting question. Like, who do you think needs to be at the table, and what does this new model look like? Who's on the team to try to really shift the way we approach brain issues and mental health issues? What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's a big topic, and even what we were saying before kind of encapsulates some of that with like the melting pot of functional medicine, because it's like we need all hands on deck. And I think like the typical thing that like I can say I went through, I think a lot of people kind of go through this. It's like they go through whatever health scare, they kind of get like chewed up, spit out by the conventional model, or more so like they fall through the gaps that the conventional model has. And because of that, people get medically traumatized or disappointed and let down and frustrated, which then causes this emotional reactivity and this somewhat a little bit of a self-indulgent, not entirely fair or accurate sentiment of like, well, conventional medicine sucks. And it's like, well, actually it doesn't. It is the most scientifically sound thing that has like ever existed,
Usually there's a lot of rigor, even if they throw out a bunch of things that are probably helpful and glom onto a pharmaceutical. At least like there's a certain amount of rigor that goes through the process. And I one of the things I love about you is that you're a nuanced thinker, and you're like, well, we don't have all the answers here either. We're all on a journey towards truth, right? And wherever the truth comes from, whatever things actually work, we need to be ready to embrace them and not be dogmatic or so biased that we can't see when things work, right?
Exactly. I think like conventional does a lot of things really well, but it's such a huge system that's attempting to keep 335 million Americans, at least speaking for America, like keep them all alive. Yeah. Keep them alive, give them quality life, longevity through that business model, which is a limited business model. So I mean, part of it helps to just take the emotions out of it, because it's not super constructive. Because like when you look at it from scientific and rigor of body of evidence, or the business model side of things. So I mean, I could go on and on with analyzing all that, but I think the audience can appreciate the limitations of conventional medicine, of like, well, if it's not drugs or surgery, they have nothing to offer you, right? And they are making moves though, right? Like some of these hospital systems are starting to bring in kind of like an integrative department, but it's such a slow moving model, right? And with business, like the market is going to go where the consumers go. That's the beauty of capitalism. So, the more that the public gets self-educated, and kind of the citizen scientist, the self-healer, whatever, as the population educates themselves of, they want to be emancipated from the pharmaceutical clutches. And, the anti-pharma sentiment is blowing up right now. And I can appreciate why, but also like essentially to help the audience kind of understand the difference is like, if I were to try to most simplistically explain like what I do, a lot of what I do is like, okay, look at a lot of pharmaceutical research of like, what is this amazingly sophisticated, well-funded system? What are they doing? Like, what are they having success with? Like, for example, I think tangible examples help with understanding of like, one of the big areas of pharmaceutical research right now for neurodegeneration and mental health is a class of drugs that are GLP-1 or glucagon-like peptide 1, either agonists or DDP4 inhibitors. So there's this GLP-1 incretin hormone made in the gut. And a long time ago, well over a decade or two ago, they started developing these drugs that work by enhancing the effect of this GLP-1 hormone that's made primarily in your intestines, but also other places in the body. And they've already approved these drugs for the clinical medical treatment of type 2 diabetes and obesity. So they're very commonly employed for diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and weight loss. So much so that they're almost kind of like, blown up as like miracle drugs, right? It's like, oh my gosh, all Americans could probably benefit from GLP-1 drug with the obesity rates, diabetes being what they are. Now, obviously, big pharma, it's like, what else can we use this drug for, right? Just like ivermectin during, like, what else can we use these things for?
Right.
So one of the big focal points with like pharmaceutical research for neurodegeneration is they're finding, well, actually, these GLP-1 drugs seem to have very, very promising therapeutic potential for neurodegeneration, which is, the degeneration of your nervous system in your brain. And then now that's going a step further of like, actually, these might be able to treat depression and mental illness too. And we don't need to go into all the cool mechanisms as to why that is. But my point being, so I look at that, which is all pharmaceutical research. But then what I do is I reverse engineer that to figure out, well, if we know that those mechanisms are very powerful for these different conditions, metabolic, mental, neurodegenerative, so on and so forth, my question becomes, So if we're trying to, like, my whole mantra is the greatest treatment is prevention, the greatest medicine balls teach people how not to need it. So if that's the mission, how can we look at that research and reverse engineer it to figure out, so what can we do with your diet, your lifestyle, your supplementation, and everything in between to modulate those same mechanisms, the same pathways, the same mechanisms that those drugs are working on? How can we naturally optimize the efficacy of those pathways? And so it's like that opens up this whole conversation of like, well, eating slowly, like chewing your food thoroughly, eating more fiber and protein, supplementing with things like, berberine or olive leaf or, whatever. So the point being, I don't think it's fair for everybody to like hate on big pharma all the time. I think the amount of power they have over like our government and media is pretty corrupt. But like, let's not necessarily demonize pharmaceutical science because it's really helpful. But what we should be looking at is what lessons can we take away from that, of like, how can we live healthier? How can we support our bodies in a way where we don't have to rely on that GLP-1 drug because our natural GLP-1 system is working really well? So that's just like one example.
It's kind of an interesting problem. The money it takes to do research, only is going to be shelled out by a company who's going to stand to profit from it. And all of the things that you and I want to employ to drive these mechanisms naturally, there's no there's no way they're going to make billions of dollars to fund the research. And so, you've got people saying, well, where's the research on berberine? I mean, there is some on that, but the point being, there's never going to be enough research on natural lifestyle driven solutions. So you have to say, well, they're spending all the money to prove all these mechanisms. Now we just need to use use what they found and say, you know what, I guarantee if that mechanism exists, there's natural ways to influence it. So I think that's pretty brilliant. And if anybody can actually stomach reading through a whole bunch of pharmaceutical research papers, more power to you.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got a mind for it.
Well, I appreciate that, and I do enjoy it. But yeah, the funding of the research is the whole thing, and that's an economic issue, not even a science. Like, so I just started my own not-for-profit research foundation, which I'm in the early, it's my third business, so it's like, the startup never ends. But that's the whole point of why I'm starting this foundation, is like, now I'm going to be busting my ass to raise money to then fund my own research. But that's the point, is like, nobody wants to spend the money to fund that research because there's no money to be made in it, because it's not about money, it's about helping the collective live a happy, healthy life of longevity. And it's like, well, why would big pharma spend the money to teach people how to live healthy without the use of pharma? Drug. Like, it's the antidote to their business model. So yeah, you can't. And that's what's kind of funny about the functional medicine space, is like, well, but we do monetize that because we're teaching people, how to live healthy and happy. But so you can still monetize it. But yeah, that's the big problem. And if people don't understand the business and economic and political aspect of the conversation, they're honestly not empowered to be able to like take, control their health, unfortunately.
Right. So, hey, let's pivot just a little bit. And let's start breaking down kind of what's really going on inside of this cranium of ours here. And let's talk about let's build out a little bit more complex thinking about the brain. And, right now people kind of think, I'm depressed, or I have anxiety, or I've got ADHD. There must be one chemical that's out of balance. And what medication can I take to make that go away? And then I'm going to go talk to a therapist, and he's going to tell me to forgive my mom. Right. I mean, so like, that's we've really got these narrow, simplistic views of what's happening. And there's a lot more going on. So I kind of spoke to this on one of my podcasts recently. I did my little best to kind of explain some of the complexity happening. But let's focus a little bit maybe on this idea of neuroinflammation and the role of inflammation driving some of these degenerative processes and even mental health issues.
Yeah, it's a huge subject, but I think we can kind of break it apart a little bit, because you kind of have to, I always like to delineate between, physiological contributors to the symptoms that we call depression and anxiety or schizoaffective or, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we have these diagnostic labels. You could argue that they're arbitrary to some degree, but you could also argue that they're constructive and helpful, because it's like, well, somebody that has schizoaffective disorder is going to need probably a different approach than, a child with autism or whatever. So,
right.
But whereas, the clinical psychology and conventional psychiatry model, it's kind of this top-down approach of like, well, let's subjectively evaluate the clinical presentation of this person's behavior and their belief systems and the symptoms that they're, demonstrating. So then we can give them a label to put them in this, diagnostic box. And now we have a standard of treatment for that diagnostic box. And we have the pharma research to say that, this treatment has, 30% efficacy or whatever it is. Right.
Yeah.
The way that
14%.
And it also might,
do any of them have 30%?
Not much, not really. Whereas in the functional world and FMHP and what we're doing is the other way around. Let's go from bottom up. I don't focus so much on the diagnostic label. I want to know what's going on in their body, what's going on at the cellular level, what's going on physiologically and biochemically. And I'm just big on objectivity, and I'm big on data tracking. And so especially with like the conventional psychiatric model, there are no, biomarkers of mental health, although that's the narrative that they have, but right. That really is not in alignment at all with the literature.
And I think the key to me, and tell me if you think I'm wrong here, but the key was into this idea that inflammation is part of the problem. Because we've got tons of markers of inflammation. Right. So if we're looking for just one marker that says, oh, when this thing is out of range, you're going to have this symptom, this kind of 1-to-1 ratio, there aren't any markers in blood work. But as soon as you start seeing the mechanisms, what's happening physiologically, and you see, oh, we've got neuroinflammation. So now we've got tons of markers to go look for. And that's really what you've kind of brought to the table with your mental map test.
Yeah, what I'm working on in a lot of ways. It's amazing how big of a body of evidence and published research there is, and yet, it takes a good 10 to 20 years for like the research that's coming out to then get integrated into like the standard practices of this massive conventional model. And so, there's a place for neuropsychiatric drugs. And I will say sometimes people that have this anti-pharma sentiment, they go down all these rabbit holes in functional medicine. And I don't think that's always a good thing, because then they're sort of avoiding getting the treatment that they probably need,
Oh, yeah.
So I actually find myself kind of like, hey, like, that's great that you want to explore holistic functional intervention strategies and adjunctive or adjuvant treatment strategy, something that's going to enhance, but, like, don't avoid getting the treatment that you might need, sort of thing.
Right.
Because there's no replacement for psychiatric drugs, really. If we can teach somebody how to get healthy and not need them, that's great. So I always say that. And in psychotherapy, there's really no substitute for it. I mean, and that's going to look different to everybody, because I know there's an anti-therapy sentiment these days too. But the point being, I always like to delineate between like, all right, psychological healing opportunities and physiological. And although they're influencing one another, right? Your thoughts trigger an epigenetic expression, thoughts become proteins, right? So yes, but in the physiology is directly impacting your psychology. So for me, it's like, look, the human condition is not curable, like we're all going to be human. We're all going to suffer. And if you apply, if you subscribe to stoicism or nihilism or whatever, you could like, oh, life is suffering, but if we can find a meaning to the suffering, whatever. But my point being, look, the human condition, it's going to be hard. There's going to be shitty moments, period. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have a mental illness or there's something horribly wrong with you. It's like, welcome to the human experience. So my thing is like, spiritual practice, psychotherapy, whatever it takes to find that sense of purpose and eudaimonia and self-actualization. But to answer the question of like neuroinflammation, the physiology, to me, correcting the physiology, that's the easy part. I might not be able to tell you what your sense of purpose and why you are here. That's your spiritual practice, your belief system. You have to find that. You have to answer those questions over the journey of your life. But physiologically, there are huge conversations we are not having. And we've been sold by big pharma this narrative that like, well, mental illness is caused by brain chemical imbalances. We don't really know why this mental illness, whether it's depression, schizophrenia, it doesn't matter. We don't know why it happens. There is hereditary genetic influence, but there's nothing you can do about that. So here's the drug and you should talk to somebody, right? And that's such an incomplete narrative. And the entire conventional psychiatric model is still really based on this outdated theory of mental illness. That was the monoamine theory, which is all about focusing on those neurotransmitters, the serotonin, the dopamine, the GABA, the acetylcholine. So, for the past 2-3 decades, the focus of big pharma and psychiatric research has been, creating these drugs that work by blocking the reuptake of serotonin or stimulating dopamine receptors, or, what are these benzodiazepines that all of the middle-aged women of America rely on to get through the day? They're NMDA receptor agonist, antagonist modulators, right? So it's just all about this kind of like brain chemical imbalance. And then, lately I have been seeing that study that came out that's like, well, there's no evidence to support that like low serotonin is the. And it's like, well, yeah, the narrative was like low serotonin. And even that, what does that mean, low serotonin? Like you have low levels.
Yeah, where? And
like where?
Serotonin levels all over the body, right? So
what does that mean, low serotonin? Like low levels of serotonin between two neurons or floating around in your blood or coming out in the urine? Like, let's be specific, right? So, but the point being with neuroinflammation, whereas the monoamine theory is what the whole psychiatric model is built on, it is shifting. And so the big pharma approach is shifting, the theory is shifting. So now the leading theories of mental illness and neurodegeneration, it's not so much about the brain chemical imbalances anymore. It's now we're really seeing that neuroinflammation and neurotrophic activity and neuroplasticity. So this kind of opens up this whole new conversation, which is a very empowering one. And if you think about your brain and all of its brain cells and neurons as, like this forest and all these cells that are turning over constantly, our neural networks, it's how our neurons are wired together, right? So neuroplasticity is kind of that neurons that fire together, wired together, right? Neuroinflammation is a chronic forest fire. Now we have to keep in mind, just like with, if we talked about inflammation in the body or chronic inflammation, there's acute inflammation, which ultimately inflammation is the cleansing fire that the immune system uses to clear out debris, fight off infection and pathogen, remodel tissues. Inflammation is a necessary physiological process to help the body heal.
Sometimes gets demonized, because inflammation's all bad. Well, no, that's not the case.
Not at all.
It's doing really important things, but it seems like sometimes inflammation kind of gets stuck on a loop, like an old vinyl LP that, just kind of not quite finishing the job and just getting locked into these kind of chronic inflammatory states, right?
Exactly. So I always like the analogy of, like a farmer will burn their field where, they dig into the ground to cut the ground, and it's a controlled burn. They have it under control. And the point of that burn is to clear out the debris and recycle nutrients back to the soil so that new crops can grow. So that's like your acute, physiologically regulated and controlled inflammation or neuroinflammation, just talking about that same process going on in the brain. That's a good thing. Like if you got COVID, just like everybody on the planet did, and you had a fever of 101, 102, and you felt crappy in the brain, what was going on there is a neuroinflammatory response regulated by the microglial cells that we can talk about, that it was protecting your brain from COVID infecting it, right? So that acute inflammatory response. The problem is when that fire never goes out, right? It just becomes chronic and that slow burn. And this is why neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's specifically, is the sixth leading cause of death in the United States.
Yeah.
The most Americans have chronic low-level meta-inflammation. And I like specificity and, quantifiable
Break
metrics.
that down a little bit.
Yeah, because so if you got COVID tomorrow and you get a fever of 102 for a few days that your body's fighting off that acute viral infection, your pro-inflammatory cytokine levels and complement proteins and mediators can increase by like 100+ fold, like 100 times the normal level. Chronic inflammation is like 2 to 3 times. It's that slow cooker. It's not very high, and this is why we need such sensitive biomarkers, because it can be hard to measure, and it's a slow burn. It's a slow degeneration over the course of time. And what's kind of cool with neurodevelopmental disorders are on the rise. The CDC just updated their autism of now it's 1 in 36. 1 in 36 kids with autism.
I'm gonna have to update my slides for my next presentation.
I know,
was
me
at
too.
1 in 50, and I was already wanting to,
yeah,
my hands up. Now we're okay.
I literally just had a post of it, 1 in 45, and then they just update. Now it's 1 in 36. Tomorrow it'll be 1 in 20. It's crazy. So developmental disorders blowing up, mental illness blowing up, mental health disorders, neurodegeneration blowing up. And we look at these as 3 separate conditions. And it's actually physiologically, it's really the same thing going on. It's just which stage in life, development, midlife, or degeneration, but it's the same process, which is essentially too much neuroinflammation. Your brain is burning up, not enough neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, which is the brain healing, remodeling, and rewiring itself. So,
and those kind of sit on a teeter-totter,
continuing,
right?
Exactly. That's the most simple way to put it. Although in some, really picky people might say that's excessively simplistic. It's not really, because conceptually it actually works. It's the same for any tissue in the body. Is the tissue able to regenerate and heal itself faster than it's degenerating, or is the degeneration process, increased faster than the healing can keep up with? It's a deviation of homeostasis.
I think you've said at one point, at any given space or place in your body, you might have anti-inflammatory activity happening, and another part you might have inflammatory, but it's the sum total. It's kind of the overarching who's winning at the end of the day. Right. Is the brain able to, repair and remodel and deal with all the, the issues that are happening, or are they accumulating because you can't clear things out faster than you're creating the mess? Yeah. And so your deep dive in all of the literature is trying to find sensitive and reproducible markers that can be that are well validated, that can kind of find these little smoldering fires of inflammation that then kind of correlate with what the clinical picture looks like. And so, yeah, we're not going to find one lab test that says, oh, this person's got X condition. But when we're measuring physiology and saying, okay, is the inflammatory state kind of running amok, or or is it tightly regulated? Are we in the pattern of neurodegeneration and mental illness issues? Does that make sense? And I think that's brilliant. So I've had a lot of hours spent trying to figure out what all these markers are. But I love the idea, empowering people with a few more tools to, make a good assessment, and a few objective things to kind of maybe stack onto a person's subjective experience and what they're reporting. I always say that, honestly, the best, you've still got to be a good clinician. You still have to listen and take a good history and dig in and figure this out. But yeah, so that's kind of a fun thing you've been working on, trying to give us a few more tools that we can employ here.
Yeah, because I think back to everything I went through, and it gets so blurry so quickly. It's hard to know which way is up, especially when you're struggling with, severe depression or brain fog or apathy, anhedonia, lethargy, whatever it is. Like when you're really on the struggle bus and you're trying to find your way out and everything just feels like shit. And then it's like, obviously, well, it's you have psychology issues and you need to talk to somebody. And it's like, this feels very physical though. Like this doesn't just feel like I have a bad outlook on life or I'm self-victimizing or feeling sorry for myself. Like, no, this feels very physical, as if like I have an injury, but it's in my head, it's in my consciousness, it's in my soul and my psyche, right? So, you know, I like the objectivity to it. And part of what I like about, the mental map panel and all of its constituent biomarkers, which are, yeah, all very well validated biomarkers. And it's kind of through the lens of getting an idea of what's going on up here. Because that way, we have some objectivity, because symptoms are going to fluctuate. You're going to have a good day, you're going to have a bad day. You're going to,
Right.
and the variables are innumerable, right? Like if you're taking, let's say, 10 to 20 supplements because your functional medicine person recommended 10 to 20 supplements, how many variables is that just between those supplements, let alone the diet and nutritional oscillations on a day-to-day basis, the
And your stress at work
exercise,
and your,
the
all of
stress
the
at
pieces. Yeah.
work, and triggers, or even barometric pressure, the atmospheric pressure. There's research to show how that can make us depressed and influence, or the
Oh, yeah.
sunlight exposure. So there's so many variables, some of which we have control of, some of which we have influence of, and some of which we have no control of at
Right.
all.
Right.
Right. So, it's not about perfection, but at least then, with when you're tracking some of these biomarkers, it gives you a more clear picture to see over the course of time, like, is my physiology correcting? Is it moving in the right direction or wrong direction? Because to me, I think that creates like a playground for exploration of, like, I'll build the fence, I'll build these physiological parameters. Now you can explore. I was just consulting with a client the other day, and, very depressed and bedridden and, all these things. And he was very excited of, like, well, I'm working with this like spiritual coach and he's really helping me reframe my beliefs. And, we're doing cold plunges and we're doing breath work and it really resonates with me. And I'm like, that's great that it resonates with you. But my question for you is, all of that holistic modality, is it going to change your biomarkers? Because, like, that's great if it resonates. That's great if you enjoy doing it and it's helping you shift your perspective. But if it's not fixing your physiology as reflected by your biomarkers, it's probably not going to work out long term. So
Right.
the point being, do whatever you want to do. If you want to go take all the psychiatric drugs in the world, great, go do it. If you want to go trip on ayahuasca in Costa Rica, great, go do it. If you want to jump on the latest carnivore, sit in cold water every day trend because all the Instagram influencers do it, great, go do that. But track your data, be objective about it, be scientific about it to see if it's working for you. Do you see, for me, and this is the model we teach through FMHP, how do we qualify progress? Like, the perceived quality of life should be getting better over the course of time. The symptomatology should be getting better over the course of time, and your biomarkers should be getting better over the course of time. But most people are just exploring and jumping on trends and
Right.
not integrating, not following through, not being consistent, not being self-accountable, too many cooks in the kitchen of, consuming all the free content on Instagram, implementing none of it, integrating none of it. You know what I mean? So that's the
Right.
hamster wheel that people get stuck on. And
And it
that's
feels like
where the
progress,
objectivity.
sometimes
Yeah.
if, busyness feels like progress. And so if there isn't a little bit of accountability, I think, I kind of asked you who needs to be at the table in the mental health space. And I kind of, in my mind, we need a functionally oriented thought person. I don't care what the letters are behind their name, but somebody who's thinking physiology first, like what's going on? How do we think about all of the systems that are influencing this, from gut, hormones, brain chemistry, like metabolic function, oxygenation, all of this. Somebody who's just thinking about physiology. And you've got to have somebody who can help you think clearly, get you out of bad, thought processes and habituated losing strategies that you've employed all your life and you can't figure out why you don't feel well. And then you kind of need a coach.
Mhm.
a life coach or a health coach or somebody who's going to help you implement. Because you kind of brought up, if you're apathetic and depressed and stressed out, you're not going to figure this out on your own.
No.
And most of those patients, I deal with, I'm like, gosh, if I can even get them to, eat every few hours to keep their blood sugar stable, they're small wins, because
Yeah.
you don't really want to get well. There's like an apathy about getting well. And so you kind of need a team around it. And I think the health coach is another piece of this puzzle, which I love. You've got people in your program that really, they're coming at this from a health coach background. And I think that's a really big piece of the puzzle, because I think health coaches are good at helping people make behavior change. And it really comes down to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think, that's why I said all hands on deck, because I like the way that you broke that down. I think I mean, for one thing, to, the professionals out there, each professional has to decide what my lane is, because
Yeah.
you can't be everything for everyone all the time. Like, that's not going to work
Right.
for anybody. And I'm a big believer in teamwork. I'm a big believer in, collaboration on the healing journey. But yeah, to your point, just the bucket of functional physiology, being objective, using lab testing, and not some of these experimental functional lab tests, but like medically established,
Mhm.
well-researched clinical biomarkers, and tracking that objectively, to make sure that the physiology and all of its constituent systems, right? We could talk about each individual system of, well, how the thyroid impacts mental health, or the adrenals, or the gut, or the liver, and that's what our program does, right? But
Right.
the functional physiology, separating that from the psychology, psycho-emotional, esoteric, spiritual, and that's a little bit more ambiguous. You kind of have to find, what does that mean for you? Is that,
Right.
is that religion? Is that a spiritual coach? Is that breath work? Is that yoga? Is that traditional psychotherapy, talk therapy? Is that all the above? Whatever. But that's a big box that has to get checked. But I like what you were saying with, the difference between a therapist and a coach. Like, a therapist is more going to hold space, occasionally ask an open-ended motivational interview question, just kind of get your gears turning and try to reframe things a little bit. A coach is on your ass and holding you accountable to the goals that you came to the coach with. A coach is there to push you, even if it's uncomfortable, to give you tough love when needed, to hold you accountable, to create this structure. It's a little bit more intensive than a therapist, right? Like, I have a therapist. This is the fourth therapist I've ever worked with in my adult life. I had 3 in my early 20s. Best therapist I've ever worked with. It's prophylactic in nature. I'm doing great. I'm thriving. So it's very like proactive, prophylactic. But I go see her like every other week. I look forward to it every time. But yeah, it's different than having a coach that's really gonna, be on you about it and holding you accountable. And one thing I was going to mention with that, and obviously I have more of a coaching background of fitness nutrition,
Right.
and it's evolved. So I talk about this a lot in the program with like the neurolimbic hack, because one of the things a lot of people subconsciously kind of fall prey to is sort of almost like being a victim of their own neurolimbic system, because the way that our neurolimbic system is evolved is to essentially encourage behaviors that get us what we want and discourage behaviors that don't lead to the desired outcome. So, great example is somebody that's overweight. They want to get healthier and lose weight and get in shape and whatever. So they sign up for the gym and they're like, cool, I'm going to work with a personal trainer and my goal is to lose 50 pounds. And so they start, busting their butt in the gym. They're expending physical resources. They're spending money to work with a personal trainer. They're restricting their diet and cutting calories and trying to eat cleaner. And their metric of success is this, very inaccurate, non-sensitive weight, just body weight.
Yeah.
Right. And so, the classic weight loss person of like, if they, like, let's say a week later, a month later, their weight goes up by 2 pounds, they freak out. And what's going on in their neurolimbic system is like, I've been busting my ass and I'm not getting the
Worse.
desired
Yeah. Yeah.
outcome, right? So why would I want to keep doing this if it's not getting me to where I want? And it's like, well, that's not a problem with the problem is you're not using the right metric to gauge success. And, so that's where, like, I saw this back when I was 18. I'm like, no, weight loss clients. Like, we're not going to use the scale as our metric of success. We're going to use way more sensitive metrics like your VO2, your resting metabolic rate, your blood chemistry. Cause like, I bet your liver enzymes and your glucose and your insulin and your triglycerides and whatever, like that's going to get better. Your leptin levels, like that's going to get better before the scale changes. Your VO2 is going to go up before the scale changes. You're
Mhm.
right. So the point
Well,
being, this is
even,
again why the data, right, give you that
yeah,
feedback, like, cool, we're moving in the right direction.
I was even just thinking body composition instead of just weight, because, right,
Yeah.
obviously that's going to shift and it might be trending in the right direction, but your muscle mass is heavier than your fat was. And so the replacement, so yeah, we just use the wrong tools, the wrong metrics.
Yeah.
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 That was, man, that was my career for a long time. It's just like, all right, let me help you understand this recomposition effect. You're gaining muscle, losing fat at the same time, so it's exactly that. But I think these days too, we're also plugged in and we have these horribly confirmation bias programmed algorithms that feed us whatever is going to elicit a nervous system response, whether it's joy or rage, doesn't really matter. As long as it gets you to stay plugged in, that's all that
To stay
matters.
scrolling, right?
Right? So, to your point, there's a lot of people that probably like, well, I read like 10 memes that are self-help memes, so I'm making progress. And it's like, that's not the same thing as doing the work. That's not the same thing as
Yeah.
making behavior changes or belief changes. So I can understand and appreciate why so many people are really, really struggling with their metabolic health, their mental health, and they just don't know where to begin, right? So I think the more we can create this roadmap, to success, the more we can help these people.
Yeah. I think that's brilliant. It's very complex. We're trying to maximize human expression, and the tie-in of psychology and physiology, life purpose, finding joy and happiness and longevity. I mean, we're asking a lot. We want it all, right? We want everything, and we're faced with the harsh realities that life's tough, and very few people get it all, right? And so we're going to have moments, and I think framing our life correctly is huge. But if we can't actually create the chemistry that is needed for our bodies to work the way it should, we're just not going to make progress. And so, getting all hands on deck, finding a roadmap that makes sense to you. There's probably a lot of starting places. There's a lot of ways in, but as long as you're evolving and having some rigor, I think, in how you think about uh, your healing journey, and you're actually kind of paying attention to what's working and what's not, and you have the end goal to be, I'm functioning really well, I'm healthy, not just I feel okay. At best, most of these pharmaceutical answers make people not feel bad,
Mhm.
but they gray out all of their life. They kind of narrow the parameters. They don't have terrible moments, but they lose, a lot of the joy and, the top end. And so I just think, for people to know that there's more,
Mhm.
even if that pharmaceutical is part of a solution, it's not the whole solution. There's so much more to be done to really maximize human expression and potential and joy in life. And so, anyway, maybe that's a good place for us to wrap up today. It has been fascinating. For those of you who are listening that are um, in the mental health space, if you're a therapist, but you kind of have a mindset that you want to know more, if you're a health coach or a functional medicine practitioner, or even just a standard, no, I mean, just a regular doctor, I want you to consider looking into Brendan and all of his work. Let's give him some website addresses and some ways we can link him in the show notes as well. But how do people learn more about you and what you've been up to?
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity. This has been a really good conversation, and I live for these types of conversations. So, you know, it's cool. I think we created through this, we covered a lot of ground, and we could have gone into the weeds on all these individual subjects, but I think we have this kind of big picture that I
Can't
hope.
believe we didn't spend like a half hour talking about microglial activation. I mean, like that's like so cool stuff. But
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
we'll save that for next time, right?
Yeah, there maybe part two sometime, because yeah, the neuroinflammation piece, it's like, in order to change our belief systems, we have to change our neural networks. And in order to change neural networks, we have to have adequate neurotrophic activity, and neuroinflammation is completely antagonistic against that. So my sort of angle, I guess, if you will, is like, all right, if we can, all these Americans that have this kind of brain on fire syndrome, if you will, the microglial activation and neuroinflammation, if we can at least put out the fire in all these people's brains, then maybe they'll be able to think a little bit more clearly and be able to create new belief systems and new neural networks. So that's kind of the angle there.
Right.
But yeah, I'm not hard to find. Instagram's my main platform, and that's at the Holistic Savage. I just put out a lot of content there. That's kind of the main place I'm active. But website is Metabolic Solutions LLC.com. And I don't think we're not hard to find on the internet, and we've it's a sizable platform. There's a lot of resources, and but yeah, it'd be amazing to have anybody get to hang out with Jerry and I in the FMHP group. It's a cool group.
Yeah, it's a very cool group. And gosh, I'm just excited for the journey. I don't know if you remember this quote. I used to think it was actually by Wayne Gretzky, but the more I researched it, I found out it was Wayne Gretzky's dad trying to teach the Pee Wee Hockey League how to play hockey. But he said, skate to where the puck is going, not where the puck has been. And I just love the idea that you and a group of people together are trying to skate to where the puck is going. The models that we've been operating with for the last few decades are incomplete at best. We need more. The mental health crisis isn't going down, it's getting worse. Our overall physiology is getting worse as a nation. Like, we need more players on the team, and we need more people thinking about how do we create something new, and how do we skate to where the puck is going, and get the healthcare delivery system matched up with the actual problem. Right now, there's a mismatch. And so anyway, I just commend you for your hard work in this area. You're a beast of a researcher. You're a beast of a man. I'll be honest with you. I'm kind of looking at the fact that your t-shirt just like even barely fits you. Just so, spending more time in the gym than anyway, always fun to connect with like minds, and I appreciate your time this morning.
Yeah, no, it was an absolute pleasure, Jerry. It's great having you in the program. Quickly, good friends and everything. So, I'm just one dude, right? Like, literally, I'm just one dude. So it's really cool to see what we as an FMHP community are doing. And it gets me hopeful, right? I think that's how every great movement starts. It starts small. It starts with a group of people. And I think the FMHP, credential and group, like, I think we can make a big difference with mental health in America. And, it's my mission, and I'm grateful to have, because I can't do it myself. So I'm grateful to have you and everybody else, and excited to see where it takes all of us.
Cool. All right, listeners, I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have questions, if this kind of spurs thoughts in your mind, hey, let's have a discussion. Let's talk about this. Both Brendan and I both believe in this team approach, and happy to get another set of eyeballs on your lab tests. Look at your blood markers and say, hey, gosh, it would be nice if we added this, this, and this, and get a bigger picture. Anyway, there's always more to be done. I always want people to feel encouraged that there's more resources out there. You haven't tried it all, I promise. And let's get some rigor and some clarity of thought process behind your condition and how you're feeling, and let's build a good life. All right. Let's promise to do this again. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, my friend. We'll look forward to it.
All right, everybody. Make sure you get out there and do something good in the world today. We'll talk to you next time.